The face staring back at me from the cracked motel mirror was a stranger, a gray, washed-out ghost of the man who had once commanded a fleet of 3,000 trucks. I brought the razor to my jaw, my hand trembling slightly, not from age, but from a rage so cold it made my bones ache. For 40 years, a thick silver beard had covered this face. It was my trademark. It was the face of Arthur Vanguard, the man who built Vanguard Logistics from a single rusted flatbed into an empire that spanned the continent. Now, as the razor scraped against my skin, pulling and tugging with the dull blade I'd bought at a gas station, I watched that man disappear into the sink, clump by silver clump. The smell of the room was a mixture of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, a scent that clung to the cheap polyester curtains and the peeling wallpaper. It was a far cry from the coastal estate I had retired to 5 years ago, the sanctuary where I thought I would spend my final years watching the tide roll in. I had handed the keys to the kingdom to my son, Julian. I had given him everything, the title, the trust, the legacy. I told myself he was ready. I told myself he understood that Vanguard Logistics wasn't just about shipping crates. It was about the families we fed, the drivers we protected, the promise that if you worked for Arthur Vanguard, you never had to worry about your pension. But the silence had grown too loud. First, the weekly update calls stopped. Then the quarterly dividend checks, the ones that funded the retired driver's assistance fund I privately managed, dried up. Then came the whispers. Old friends, men I had started out with on the loading docks, calling me in the middle of the night, their voices thick with fear. He's firing the old guard, Artie. He's cutting corners on maintenance. The brakes failed on number 402 last week. I didn't want to believe it. A father never wants to believe his son is a butcher. So I came to see for myself. But I couldn't walk in as Arthur Vanguard. If I did, the walls would go up, the books would close, and the smiles would be plastered on. To see the rot, I had to be a nobody. I applied the hair dye next. It was a box of chestnut brown I'd picked up at a pharmacy. I worked the chemical paste into my thinning hair, watching as the dignified silver turned into a muddy, desperate brown. It stung my scalp. It looked pathetic. It looked exactly like what I needed to be. Arthur Penelligan, a 70-year-old failure desperate for a paycheck. I put on the suit. It was a charcoal polyester blend I'd found at a thrift store. It was too tight in the shoulders and smelled faintly of mothballs and someone else's sweat. I adjusted the thick, plastic-rimmed glasses that distorted my vision just enough to make me squint. I looked at the resume on the bed. Data archivist. Entry level. Arthur Penelligan. It was a fiction, a plea for relevance from a man the world had forgotten. I picked it up. I walked out of the motel room, leaving Arthur Vanguard behind in the drain. The headquarters of Vanguard Logistics rose out of the city skyline like a dagger of glass and steel. I had built the original office, a brick building with big windows that opened to let the breeze in. Julian had demolished it 2 years ago to build this monolith. The lobby was freezing, air-conditioned to the point of discomfort, with floors of polished marble that echoed every footstep. It felt less like a place of business and more like a mausoleum. I walked to the reception desk. The young woman sitting there looked terrified. She was typing furiously, her eyes darting to the elevators every few seconds as if she expected a monster to emerge. "I have an interview," I said, pitching my voice higher, making it sound thin and reedy, "for the archivist position." She looked at me, confusion clouding her eyes. She didn't check a computer. She just pointed to a row of uncomfortable modern chairs against the wall. "Sit," she whispered. "Mr. Vanguard he's running behind. He's in a mood. Just..." Mr. Vanguard. The name used to inspire respect. Now it clearly inspired terror. I sat, and I waited. I waited for 2 hours. It was a power move, a classic intimidation tactic I had taught Julian to never use on partners, let alone potential employees. But he was using it on an old man he thought was desperate. I watched the employees rush through the lobby. They didn't walk with the purposeful stride of people who loved their jobs. They scurried. Their heads were down. They clutched their coffees like lifelines. I saw Tom, a dispatcher who had been with me since the 90s, walk past.
He looked 10 years older than I remembered, his face gray and drawn. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floor. The atmosphere was toxic. It hung in the air like ozone before a lightning strike. Finally, the receptionist's phone buzzed.
She picked it up, listened, and went pale. "He'll see you now," she said. "Top floor." I took the elevator up. The ride was smooth, silent, and swift. When the doors opened, I stepped into what used to be my office. It was unrecognizable. My mahogany desk was gone, replaced by a slab of glass that looked like a jagged piece of ice. The warm leather chairs were gone. The photos of the First Fleet, the framed dollar bill, the picture of Julian catching his first fish, all gone. The room was stark, white, and sterile. Julian sat behind the glass desk. He didn't look up when I entered. He was scrolling through his phone, his thumb moving with a manic rhythm. He looked older than 42. His face was puffy, bloated with expensive scotch and late nights. His suit was impeccable, Italian wool that cost $5,000, but he wore it uncomfortably, pulling at the collar. He looked hard, not the hardness of a man who works, but the hardness of a man who crushes things. I stood there for a full minute, clutching my hat in my hands, playing the role. "Mister," I ventured softly. He held up a finger, silencing me without looking away from his screen. He swiped again, chuckled at something, and then finally, slowly, dropped the phone onto the desk. He looked at me. His eyes were dead. There was no recognition, no spark of humanity. He saw a cheap suit, bad hair, and wrinkles. He saw a bug. "Penn Halligan," he said, saying the name like it left a bad taste in his mouth. He picked up my resume, which was sitting on the edge of his desk, and held it by the corner as if it were contaminated. "I was reading this while you were rotting in the lobby." I have experience, sir," I stammered, introducing a tremor into my voice. 40 years in logistics. I know the filing systems." "History," Julian sneered, tossing the paper back onto the desk. It slid across the glass and fluttered to the floor. He didn't apologize. He expected me to pick it up. "That's the problem with you people. You're obsessed with history. I'm building a future. Why are you here? You're 70. Why aren't you feeding pigeons in a park somewhere?" I bent down, my knees cracking audibly, and retrieved the resume. The humiliation burned in my chest, a hot coal of indignation. I had changed his diapers. I had paid for his MBA. I had given him the world. "I need the work, sir," I said, looking at my shoes. "My pension, it's not what it used to be." Julian laughed.
It was a cruel, jagged sound, devoid of warmth. "Inflation, right. Or maybe you just didn't plan well. We don't hire dinosaurs here, Penhaligon. We hire sharks." He leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and looked at me with a mixture of amusement and disgust. "Let's see if your brain still works, old man. There's a tablet on the chair next to you." I reached for the sleek black device. My hands shook, partially an act, partially the adrenaline flooding my system. "Open the PDF marked Q3 projections," Julian commanded. I fumbled with it. I tapped the wrong icon intentionally. I swiped the screen clumsily. Julian sighed loudly. "Jesus Christ, it's a touch screen, not a telegraph. Press the blue icon, the blue one." "I'm trying, sir," I whispered. "It's just, everything is different from what you're used to," he snapped. "The world moved on." I looked up at him. I looked at the son I had carried on my shoulders at the county fair, the boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee. I realized then that he didn't just disrespect me. He hated me. He hated what I represented. He hated the age, the slowness, the decency. He looked at me and saw a relic to be smashed. I lowered the tablet. The silence in the room stretched, filled only by the hum of the server banks in the next room. I gave him the world, and he turned it into a weapon. He looks at me and sees a confused old man in a cheap suit. He doesn't know he is looking at the architect of his own destruction. If you are watching this, listen to me closely. Never assume your children will inherit your values just because they inherited your name. Sometimes you raise a wolf and don't realize it until he bares his teeth at your throat. Tell me in the comments if you've ever felt invisible to the people who should respect you most, because right now,
I feel like a ghost in my own house." Julian opened his mouth to dismiss me, to throw one last insult, when his personal cell phone rang. It wasn't the office line. It was his burner. I knew because I recognized the ringtone, the opening bars of a song about money. He glanced at the screen. His demeanor changed instantly. He looked hungry. He answered it, putting it on speakerphone and tossing it onto the desk. He didn't care that I was there. To him, I was furniture. I was irrelevant. "Talk to me," Julian said. The voice on the other end was slick, fast, and familiar.
It was his personal lawyer, a man named Sterling, who charged $1,000 an hour to find loopholes in moral decency. "Julian, the pension fund transfer is ready," Sterling said. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. "I found the bypass in the bylaws. We can liquidate the assets by Friday. The employees won't know until the checks bounce next month." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The pension fund. The fund I had started in 1985. The fund that was supposed to be untouchable. It held the life savings of 500 men and women, drivers, mechanics, secretaries, people who had broken their backs for this company, people who trusted the name Vanguard. "Does it do what you say?" Julian asked, a grin spreading across his face. "It does," Sterling replied. "But Julian, this is the nuclear option. Once we drain it, there's no going back. The company will be insolvent. The liability shields might hold, but the workforce—" Julian picked up a silver pen and twirled it between his fingers. He looked right at me. He looked right into my eyes, but he didn't see his father. He saw a mirror reflecting his own callousness. "Do it," Julian said. His voice was steady. "Drain it. I'm selling the company to the private equity firm next week anyway." "What about the employees?" asked. "Let the old geezer starve," Julian said, his lip curling in a sneer. "They're dead weight anyway." The rage that exploded in my chest was so sudden, so violent, that my vision blurred. He wasn't just rude. He wasn't just arrogant. He was a criminal. He was stealing the livelihoods of the people I had sworn to protect. He was gutting my legacy, my name, my honor, just to cash out and move on to his next toy. He was a monster, and I had created him. Julian tapped the phone to end the call. He looked at me, seemingly surprised I was still there. "What happened, Penhaligon?" he asked, not worried, just amused. "That's business, Penhaligon. That's how the sausage gets made." He waved his hand at the door, a dismissive flick of the wrist. "You're dismissed, Grandpa. We don't have a place for you. Go find a Walmart to greet." I stood up. I placed the tablet gently on the desk. My hands were shaking, but not from the act anymore. They were shaking from the effort of not reaching across the glass and strangling him. "Thank you for your time," I whispered. Yeah. I turned and walked to the door. I didn't look back. I walked through the outer office, past the terrified receptionist, and into the elevator. The doors slid shut, enclosing me in a box of polished steel. I was alone. I reached up and pulled the thick plastic glasses off my face. I threw them into the corner of the elevator. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, wiping the sweat and the shame from my forehead. I looked at my reflection in the steel doors. The brown hair was ridiculous. The suit was garbage. The man looking back at me was tired, old, and heartbroken. But beneath the cheap disguise, beneath the grief of a father who has just realized his son is beyond redemption, something else was waking up. Arthur Penhaligon didn't get the job. He was just a confused old man who fed pigeons. But Arthur Vanguard, the man who stared back at me now, had eyes like flint. The man who stared back at me was the man who had broken unions and negotiated treaties and built a skyscraper out of grit. Arthur Vanguard wasn't going to feed pigeons. Arthur Vanguard was about to fire the CEO. A suit is more than just fabric and stitching. It is a suit of armor designed to repel weakness. And for the last 5 years, my armor had been hanging in the back of a cedar closet, gathering dust, while I tried to learn how to be a civilian.
I stood in the guest bedroom of Margaret's house, looking at the man in the mirror. The mousy brown hair dye had been scrubbed away, washing down the drain in a swirl of muddy chemical water. My hair was silver again, a lion's mane that commanded respect simply by existing. The cheap polyester rags of Arthur Peneligan were in the trash can. In their place, I wore a bespoke charcoal wool three-piece suit, tailored on Savile Row, the same suit I had worn the day I rang the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange. It fit differently now. I was a little thinner, a little more worn by the friction of betrayal, but the shoulders still held me up. I adjusted my tie, a silk crimson knot that felt like a declaration of war. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching me. She was my retired CFO, a woman who could balance a ledger down to the penny and who knew where every skeleton in Vanguard Logistics was buried because she had helped dig the holes. She was holding a mug of tea, her hands shaking slightly. "You look like him again," she said softly. "I am him," I replied, smoothing the lapels. Arthur Peneligan was a desperate old man begging for scraps. I turned to face her. She nodded, walking over to the dresser where a thick leather portfolio lay waiting.
I pulled the original incorporation documents from my personal safe. The golden share certificate is on top. It's signed, notarized, and irrevocable. "And stealing the pension fund constitutes a breach," I said. "It constitutes a felony, Arthur," she corrected, her voice hard. We had spent the last 3 days in a state of suspended animation, a quiet war room atmosphere where the only sounds were the clicking of keys and the playing of that damnable recording. I had played Julian's voice for her the night I arrived. Let the old geezers starve. They're dead weight anyway. Margaret had wept. She knew Tom the dispatcher and Mary in payroll. She had signed their birthday cards for 30 years. Her grief had turned to a cold, razor-sharp fury that matched my own. "The board meeting starts in an hour," Margaret said, checking her watch. "The equity firm representatives landed this morning." "He won't sign anything," I said. I picked up the portfolio. It was heavy, weighted with the destruction of my son's life. That was the tragedy of it. I wasn't walking into that boardroom to save my company. I was walking in to execute my child. I had spent 42 years loving him, forgiving him, making excuses for his sharpness, hoping that the jagged edges of his personality would smooth out with age. Instead, they had sharpened into knives. Margaret asked. "It's already ugly, Margaret," I said, opening the door. The drive to the glass tower was silent. I sat in the back of the town car Margaret had hired, watching the city slide by. It was raining, a gray, miserable drizzle that slicked the streets. When we pulled up to the curb, I didn't go through the main entrance where the terrified receptionist sat. I knew the building better than the architects who designed it. I knew about the private executive elevator in the parking garage, the one that required a keycard that had supposedly been deactivated 5 years ago. It hadn't been. I kept the master key on my ring, a sentimental keepsake I never thought I'd use. The elevator ride was smooth and swift, a silent ascent towards Judgment Day. As the numbers climbed, 20, 30, 40, I felt my heart rate slow down. The anger that had been vibrating in my chest for days solidified into a block of ice. I wasn't a father anymore. I was the chairman. The elevator doors opened directly into the anteroom of the main boardroom. I could hear voices through the heavy mahogany doors. The muffled, confident baritones of men who think they are about to make a lot of money. "The transition will be seamless," Julian's voice drifted through the wood, arrogant and smooth. "We've already streamlined the workforce projections. The pension liability is being handled." Off the books. That was his euphemism for theft. I didn't knock. I didn't hesitate. I placed my hand on the brass handles and shoved the double doors open. They swung inward with a heavy, expensive whoosh, slamming against the stoppers. The sound in the room died instantly. It was a tableau of corporate greed. 12 men sat around the long, polished table. The board of directors, men I had appointed, men who had betrayed me by enabling my son, sat on one side. The representatives from the private equity firm, looking like sharks in Italian suits, sat on the other. And at the head of the table sat Julian. He was holding a crystal tumbler of water, mid-toast. He looked frozen, his mouth slightly open, his eyes widening as he processed the figure standing in the doorway. He didn't see the mousy-haired, stooped old man from Monday. He saw the silver-haired titan who cast a shadow over his entire life. "Julian," he snapped, his instinct for dominance kicking in before his brain caught up. He squinted, the recognition lagging. "Security! I said this was a closed—" He stopped. The glass tumbler slipped from his fingers. It hit the table, shattering, sending water and shards of crystal skittering across the polished wood. "Julian," he whispered. "You didn't hire me on Monday, Julian," I said. My voice was low, resonant, filling the acoustic space of the room without effort. I walked into the room. My footsteps on the plush carpet were heavy, deliberate. The directors gasped. Murmurs broke out. "Arthur, I thought he was in hospice. I thought he was in Europe." "Dad, you're confused," Julian stammered, his face draining of color, turning a sickly shade of paste. He scrambled to stand up, knocking his chair back. "You shouldn't be here. You're having an episode. Someone call security." I reached the head of the table. I didn't stop until I was standing 2 feet from him. I looked him up and down, smelling the fear on him. It smelled like expensive cologne turning sour. "Sit down, boy," I commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the voice of a father who had taught him how to walk, how to tie his shoes, how to be a man. The authority was primal.
Julian's knees buckled. He collapsed back into his chair, looking small. "I didn't come for a job," I told the room, turning my gaze to the equity partners. They were watching with fascinated horror, sensing that the deal was imploding in real time. "This is highly irregular," the lead equity partner said, a man named Sterling, who looked like he charged by the second. "Mr. Vanguard, your son has full power of attorney and executive control." "The papers are built on fraud," I said. Julian shouted, finding his voice again. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're old. You're out of the loop. I built this valuation." "You gutted it," I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, portable Bluetooth speaker. I placed it on the center of the table, right next to the shattered glass. "Monday morning," I said to the board, 10:15 a.m. I pressed play. The audio was crisp. It cut through the air conditioning hum like a knife. Julian's voice. "Drain it. I'm selling the company to the equity firm next week. Let the old geezer starve." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush lungs. The equity partners looked at each other. They closed their laptops in unison. The click of the screens shutting sounded like gunshots. Sterling stood up. Julian screamed, standing up again, his hands shaking. That's out of context. That's a deep fake. He's manipulating you. It's a legal recording." "It's a whistleblower recording," I corrected him, my voice cold. I opened the leather portfolio. I pulled out the document Margaret had kept safe for 5 years, the golden share certificate. I slid it down the table. It spun and stopped in front of the board secretary. "Read it," I said. The secretary, a man named Henderson, who had always been weak, picked it up with trembling fingers. It's a Class A preferred stock certificate," Henderson stammered, "issued to Arthur Vanguard." Julian stared at the paper. "That doesn't exist. I checked the books." "You checked the digital records, Julian," I said. "You didn't check the physical safe in the Foundation's archive. You were too lazy." I turned to the board. I looked each of them in the eye. "I am invoking the golden share clause," I announced. "Effective immediately, the CEO is removed for cause." Julian shrieked. He looked wild now, his hair disheveled, his eyes manic. "It's my company. I waited for you to die. I waited 5 years." The scream echoed in the room, ugly and raw.
It was the truth, finally spoken aloud. He hadn't wanted the responsibility. He had wanted the inheritance. He had wanted the corpse to clear the room so he could loot the vault. He lunged at me. It was a clumsy, desperate move. He reached across the table, grabbing for my throat, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He screamed. The boardroom doors burst open again. 2 large men in dark uniforms stepped in. They weren't the private security contractors Julian had hired. They were my men, Mike and Sal, the head of site security from the old days. I had called them an hour ago. They didn't look at Julian as the CEO. They looked at him as a threat. Sal barked, grabbing Julian by the back of his expensive Italian suit and yanking him away from me. Julian flailed, swinging wildly. "Get your hands off me. I own you. I'll fire you." Sal pinned his arms behind his back with practiced ease. "You're done, Julian." Julian struggled, panting, his face pressed against the carpet. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. Tears of rage, not remorse. "You ruined me," he sobbed. "You set me up. You came in here in a disguise to humiliate me. Why?" I walked around the table. I stood over him. I looked down at the boy I had raised, the man who had ordered the starvation of 500 families without blinking. "I didn't ruin you, Julian," I said quietly. "You ruined yourself when you decided that people were just numbers. You didn't inherit a company. You inherited a responsibility, a sacred trust to feed the families that built this place." "I hate you," he whispered. "I know," I said. I nodded to Sal. "Get him out of here, and call the police." They dragged him out. He kicked and screamed, a child throwing a tantrum in the ruins of his own ambition. The elevator doors closed on his screams, cutting off the noise, leaving the boardroom in a stunned silence. The equity partners had already left. The board members were staring at their hands, terrified that they were next. "Get out," I said to the board. "All of you. Resignations on my desk by morning." They fled. They ran like rats. I was left alone in the room. I walked to the head of the table. I sat down in the chair Julian had vacated. The leather was still warm. The shattered glass lay on the table, a pool of water soaking into the wood. It was quiet. The hum of the city below was distant. I was back in control. I had saved the pension fund. I had saved the jobs.
I had saved the name Vanguard. But as I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the gray skyline, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a man standing in a graveyard. Margaret walked in a few minutes later. She carried a cup of coffee. She set it down in front of me and put a hand on my shoulder. "It's done, Arthur," she said softly. "The bank froze the transfer." "I know," I replied. I took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter. "You did the right thing," she said. I asked. "I just sent my son to prison, Margaret." "He destroyed his own life," she said firmly. I nodded slowly. She was right. Logically, she was right. Morally, she was right. But paternally, it felt like I had cut off my own arm. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I saw the silver hair, the bespoke suit, the face of a titan of industry. But behind the eyes, I saw the old man in the cheap motel room, the ghost who had just wanted to be wrong. I built an empire of steel and glass. I built a fleet that could move mountains. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to build the character of the man who would inherit it. I taught him about margins and leverage, but I forgot to teach him about mercy. I saved the company, but I couldn't save him. I took a deep breath, pushing the grief down into the box where I kept the rest of my scars. There was work to do. There were apologies to make to the staff. There was a mess to clean up. "Get the new organizational chart ready, Margaret," I said, turning my chair away from the window. Sometimes, the hardest thing a father has to do isn't to build a future for his son. Sometimes, the hardest thing a father has to do is fire him.